James Richards had always been a dreamer. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, he was surrounded by families who struggled to make ends meet. His father worked long hours as a construction worker, and his mother was a nurse who barely had time to sit down. Despite their best efforts, their hard work often felt like it wasn't enough. Money was always tight. There were no luxuries, no vacations, and James began to realize early on that financial security was a rare commodity. But it didn't crush his spirit. Instead, it planted a seed. He wasn't content to live a life that was handed to him. He wanted more. He wanted freedom, success, and a future that wasn't dictated by the limitations of his environment. James had always felt a strange pull toward entrepreneurship, but it seemed like an impossible dream. He didn't know how to make it happen, and there weren't many role models in his neighborhood to look up to. But even as a young man, he had an unshakable belief that there was something more out there for him. This belief kept him awake at night, wondering how he could break free from the cycle of financial struggle that seemed to have no end. He wasn't sure what business he would start or how it would even begin, but he knew he had to try. After high school, James didn't have the luxury of going to college. His family couldn't afford it, and frankly, he didn't know if he could make it in a traditional educational setting anyway. Instead, he found work at a local grocery store starting as a cashier. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a job. Over time, he took on more hours, and though he worked tirelessly, he often felt trapped. It wasn't the type of work that sparked joy, and it didn't feel like it was leading anywhere. He would look at the well-dressed people passing by and envy their confidence, their air of success. But deep down, he also believed that success was a possibility for him too, even if it seemed distant. In his spare time, James read constantly. He devoured books about self-made entrepreneurs, stories of people who started with nothing and built something incredible. He read biographies, how-to books, and success stories. Anything that could provide the secret to breaking through. These books gave him a sense of hope, but they also made him feel like an outsider. So many of the people he read about seemed to have advantages he didn't, like access to resources, education, or wealth. But then, one day, something changed. James had just gotten off work and was standing outside the store contemplating his future. He felt exhausted and frustrated. That's when an older man, well-dressed and walking with purpose, passed by him. The man stopped, noticing James standing there, lost in thought. "You look like you could use some advice," the man said with a smile. James was taken aback. Yeah, I guess I could," he replied, uncertain where this conversation might go. The man looked at him thoughtfully for a moment. "You know, life doesn't wait. If you're waiting for the perfect moment, you might be waiting forever. You have to take action, even if it's just a small step. Start now." The words hit James like a lightning bolt. Start now. It was such a simple phrase, but it resonated with him deeply. In that moment, he realized that the reason he was stuck wasn't because he lacked the ability, but because he was waiting for the perfect opportunity to show up. Instead of waiting, he needed to take that first step. And that's exactly what he did. That night, James went home and sat down at his desk. He started researching ideas for a business he could start. He didn't have a clear vision yet, but he knew he needed to try. After weeks of brainstorming, he decided to create an online store selling handmade crafts. He had always been good at making small items like jewelry and keychains, and he figured that could be a good starting point. But of course, the road wasn't easy. James had no idea how to build a website, market products, or run an online business. He didn't even know where to begin, but he refused to be discouraged. He spent hours watching tutorials, reading articles, and taking online courses to learn everything he could. The more he learned, the more confident he became. Even though his savings were small, he used what he had to buy materials and start creating products. After weeks of effort, James launched his website. He posted a few products and waited. And waited. For days, nothing happened. No sales, no traction. The initial excitement was fading, replaced by the growing reality of how hard it was to get noticed online. James felt discouraged, but then he remembered the advice the older man had given him. Take that small step forward. James knew that this was the beginning. It was not going to be easy, but nothing worth having ever came easily. Instead of giving up, James decided to reach out to influencers in the craft and DIY community. He offered them free products in exchange for exposure. Slowly, he began to see some results. Sales started trickling in. People were beginning to notice his products. Each order was a small victory. It wasn't much, but it was progress. As the months went by, James's business grew steadily. He reinvested every penny he made back into the company, upgrading the website, improving the product designs, and even hiring a small team to help with photography and fulfillment. Still, the growth wasn't without setbacks. There were challenges with suppliers, problems with shipping, and customer complaints. But with each obstacle, James learned and adapted. He had to be resourceful, determined, and creative. And through it all, his business continued to expand. Then, one day, out of nowhere, James received an email from a large retailer. They had been following his brand's success online and were interested in a partnership. This was the break he had been waiting for, but it came with one huge catch. The retailer wanted him to fulfill a large order, much larger than anything he had ever handled before. It was a risk, a big risk. He could accept the offer and face the possibility of failing, or he could turn it down and remain where he was. James paused for only a moment before making his decision. He knew that if he didn't take this risk, he might never get another opportunity like it. So, he took the leap. For weeks, James and his team worked day and night to fulfill the order. There were moments when they thought they wouldn't make the deadline. The pressure was intense, but James refused to let it defeat him. When the products were finally shipped and the retailer launched their campaign, James's business took off like a rocket. Orders poured in from all over the country and eventually internationally. What had once been a small online store was now a full-fledged, thriving business. James's success didn't come overnight. It took years of hard work, setbacks, and failure. But through it all, he never gave up. He learned that success wasn't about avoiding failure. It was about how you handled failure, how you got back up each time you fell. He also realized that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the greatest rewards. Years later, James stood in his office, looking out at the city skyline. He thought back to that night outside the grocery store when he felt so lost. He had come a long way. He had built something real. But more than anything, he had proved to himself that no matter where you start, with enough perseverance, you can reach your dreams. He wasn't just successful, he was fulfilled. He had created something that mattered to him and in the process had changed his life forever.